In this final section of the presentation, we take a step back from the technical formulas and talk about how Proposition 98 actually affects budget decisions. Specifically, we will review 4 key Proposition 98 related decisions that policymakers can face. While the Proposition 98 formulas operate automatically, there are ways in which the legislature's budgetary decisions affect K-14 spending. The first decision is whether the legislature even opts to follow the formulas. Next, we'll discuss 2 ways in which the legislature can change the Proposition 98 requirement by lowering the prior year's funding base or by altering general fund revenues. The final decision deals not with the total amount of Proposition 98 funding, but with how to spend the education dollars. Each year, policymakers put the budget together based on a forecast of what revenues the state will receive in the coming year. Similarly, at the time of the Budget Act, the legislature funds Proposition 98 based on an estimate of what the requirement, or minimum guarantee, will be in the coming year. Over the course of the year, actual revenues may come in higher or lower than originally forecast. K-12 attendance, another factor in the formula, can also change from original estimates. Correspondingly, the actual Proposition 98 requirement may end up higher or lower than what was originally forecast. In this way, the Proposition 98 requirement is often a moving target throughout the year. Although the actual requirement may be a moving target that doesn't lock in until revenues are finalized up to a year and a half later, the legislature must still make a Proposition 98 appropriation at the time of the budget enactment. So what happens if that initial estimate ends up being too high or too low? Well, if higher revenues lead to a higher requirement than what was initially funded at the Budget Act, the legislature must make up the difference and provide the additional funding. This is referred to as settle up. This is not a choice. It is required by the constitutional formulas. If lower revenues lead to a lower requirement than the Budget Act funding level, then the legislature has the option to reduce funding to the lower revised minimum guarantee. This reduction does not happen on the natural. It takes legislative action to amend the Budget Act and reduce funding. Now this leads us to the first key Proposition 98 related budget decision for the legislature, whether to fund at the Proposition 98 minimum guarantee. As discussed earlier, policymakers always have the option to fund at a higher or lower level than what the formulas would otherwise require. However, overriding the formulas is not without challenges. Providing more is often referred to as an over-appropriation, because it is appropriating over the requirement. While this has taken place a number of times in the past, the legislature is often cautious about taking this approach because it can raise the Proposition 98 spending requirement in future years. This is because the prior year's funding level is one factor that affects the next year's requirement. Thus, whenever the legislature chooses to raise the funding level, that higher base can carry forward into subsequent years. The legislature can also provide less than the formulas require, but only by voting to suspend the Proposition 98 requirement. This takes a 2/3 vote and can be politically difficult to do. The legislature has only taken that 2/3 vote to suspend Proposition 98 once, in 2004-05. Now, as noted earlier, in many years revenues decline from initial forecasts, and the Proposition 98 requirement drops after the Budget Act. In this case, the legislature can decide whether to reduce Proposition 98 spending to the newly lowered minimum guarantee. While the constitutional formulas allow this flexibility, it can be very difficult, both logistically and politically, to cut school spending in the middle of the year, in large part because schools are already running programs and have hired staff for the year. Therefore, such reductions have usually been targeted where funds are not likely to be spent. However, leaving Proposition 98 spending at the Budget Act level means spending more than what is actually required, which can have short and long-term consequences. If the state doesn't make the mid-year reduction to education, it could mean making deeper cuts in other areas of the budget, or drawing down the state's reserve. As discussed, this decision would also affect the budget in subsequent years, because spending in one year becomes the funding base for the next year. So if the state doesn't reduce down to the requirement, it can carry that higher base into the next year as well. In the past, when revenues have dropped mid-year, the legislature has often looked for creative solutions, such as using one-time funds, delaying implementation of new programs, or funding deferrals to protect schools from inconvenient mid-year cuts while reducing the Proposition 98 spending to realize some savings at the state level. In other years, the legislature has just left funding over-appropriated at the original Budget Act level.
Another budget decision that policymakers face each year is whether to modify the state's tax policy and change the amount of revenues flowing into the general fund. This can have implications for Proposition 98. Specifically, increasing tax revenue can increase the Proposition 98 requirement. Conversely, decreasing revenues can lower the requirement. The exact effect of revenue increases or decreases on the Proposition 98 requirement can vary depending on a number of factors. But a rough rule of thumb that has applied in recent years is that the Proposition 98 effect is about half of every dollar increase or decrease. For example, if the legislature decides to raise the sales tax and generate $1 billion in new general fund revenues, in some cases the Proposition 98 requirement will increase by about $500 million. To put another way, about half of the new revenue must be spent on Proposition 98. This interaction is important to keep in mind if policymakers are attempting to generate revenue to use for another non-education purpose. It could be that only half of the new revenue is available for that other purpose. Now, we spend a lot of time talking about formulas and the ways that the legislature can influence the Proposition 98 funding amount. But once a Proposition 98 spending level has been determined, each year the legislature faces the important task of deciding what that funding will be spent on. As noted, Proposition 98 is silent on this point. It is completely up to the legislature to decide how to allocate the funds. Existing statute says that about 11% of Proposition 98 funds should be used for community colleges, with the remainder left for K-12 education. While this statute is waived in some years, the legislature has tended to split Proposition 98 funding in roughly these proportions. In addition to the ongoing Proposition 98 funding, the legislature typically faces annual decisions about how to allocate one-time funds for K-14 education. These are usually unspent Proposition 98 funds from prior years, which have often totaled several $100 million annually.
Congratulations! You've made it through an introductory tour of Proposition 98. For additional information, please see our website, which includes a Proposition 98 primer written in 2005, as well as recent handouts and publications on current education budget proposals. And please call the staff of our education section if you have any further questions.